I'm assuming by the fact the lights have gone up that that's my cue to welcome you all back to the afternoon session of the conference. I'm going to be very brief, I think I've been given up to 3 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes, so very brief to introduce Mayor Andy Burnham, who obviously really needs no introduction. So I thought I would just make one comment, which I hope Andy may touch on in his remarks. There's been a lot of discussion about devolution and I think a lot of frustration in the room and from speakers that devolution hasn't been more radical, and I imagine Andy may have some comments to make about the need for more radical devolution. But there's also been a lot of observations of the fact that there has been a great deal of innovation at a local level, and therefore people are using the power and the resources that are available to them to innovate, to do things differently, to quote Andy last year. And that is the opportunity, I think, that devolution gives. But I also wanted just to very briefly mention, or rather to echo previous speakers on the issue of hyperlocal community activity. Because actually, devolution, the state and civic society are not the same thing. And a lot of you probably missed, but a brilliant local trust video that was put on after the first plenary session this morning. And we saw a series of people in community organisations telling us what their activity wasn't. So we saw someone say, this isn't a litter pick. I mean, it quite patently was a litter pick, but to them it wasn't. This isn't a youth group. This isn't a knitting group. And do you know why? Because actually for them, it's about relationships, it's about pride, it's about purpose, and it's about belonging. And I'm a trustee, I have a great honour of being a trustee of Local Trust, and we visited the big local programme in Burnham. I would say just down the road, probably slightly further than just down the road, but in Stockport. And we met a lady there in a community garden, and she was telling us about the transformative impact that being part of that big local in Burnham had had on her life. So she'd gone from having really poor mental health, essentially being a recluse, not venturing out of her house, being totally kind of, locked in. It was in a lockdown, but much more so than we were. And she talked about what being able to come to this community garden had meant to her and how transformative it had been for her life. The state can't do that. And that's why it's really important that we make the distinction between the importance of devolving public services, funding, state institutions, and involving citizens to actually saying, do you know what? Community groups, citizens themselves need to be able to have that power, because relationships and pride and belonging doesn't come from the state. It comes from the collection of people in a local area. And I hope that Andy may reflect on some of that. So I will shut up now, as I've probably already gone over my 2 to 3 minutes. But it is a great honour to introduce Mayor Andy Burnham. And I think we're particularly pleased, given that you'll all be aware we have local elections. So we are, as citizens, exercising our democratic rights tomorrow. And Andy has generously taken time out of what I assume is probably quite a manic election campaign period to come and talk to us today. There won't be any Q&A, but we are going to go straight into a fantastic next session afterwards. So can we put our hands together to welcome Andy?
Thanks very much indeed, Charlotte. Good afternoon, everybody. Great to see you all in our fine city, the home of 24-hour party people, or as the Prime Minister would say, the home of 24-hour work-related event people. For those of you who are staying later, we hope you get to a few work-related events while you're here. A cheap jibe there, but I'm going to make a sort of a fairer political point, and that is levelling up. Actually, the Prime Minister's come up with a concept there that isn't going away, is it? You know, I think we can all be cynical sometimes about slogans that we hear in politics. Big society was one that, in a similar vein, we used to throw around a few years ago. Northern powerhouse came and kind of went a bit from the government's language. Local industrial strategy, the same. I've just noticed that people aren't letting go of this one. And that's a really, really good thing. And it's really great that the local trusts have brought this event to Greater Manchester today, because it shows to me, and I look at this room and all of you here, really trying to get into what could this mean at the very local level. it says to me that you all see that it is the thing this country really needs to do, to build a sense of agency in all of our communities, a sense of direction for communities. We're all suffering, aren't we, from living in a country in recent decades where some parts of the country felt they were being neglected and didn't have a sense of a clear path, a future. And the political consequences of that have been felt, and we're all dealing with that. So I think we're in this room, aren't we, and we're thinking about this. And actually today, thinking about it at a very local level, which is what also we should do, because we're not prepared to let go of this idea. And that's a good thing. I think it is still more slogan than substance, for honest. I'm not saying the government haven't done anything to help us begin the process of levelling up Greater Manchester with Greater London, but it's nowhere near enough. You know, I always kind of point to the biggest piece of work on the whole question of regional inequality, which was led by a former head of the civil service, Lord Kerslake, through the UK 2070 Commission a couple of years ago. It pointed out two things which are simultaneously true about our country and actually are, in my view, connected. Firstly, that we are the most politically over-centralised country in the OECD. I think it's the UK and Slovakia, if I remember correctly, the two that he pointed to. Completely over-centralised in terms of political power. But we are also one of the most regionally unbalanced. And I believe those two things are linked. If you take power away from places and you hoard power in one place, it follows that all areas will not prosper equally. Some places are more equal than others in this country, and many of those places are within the M25. And we've got to change that if we want a country where it's going to be a place where everyone feels they have a stake, where everywhere has a sense of future. We've got to do something about that. So that's why we're all not letting go of levelling up, which is great, actually. And I want to really thank you all for being here today and the partners who've worked with the local trust to put this on. However, I think we do also have to begin with a reality check with regard to what we've all just lived through and what it's revealed. So if we think back to March 2020 when the tide went out, I think we saw more clearly what was there on the seabed of our poorest communities than we'd ever been able to see before. I think we had a sense through the last couple of decades that the nature of people's work was deteriorating, becoming less secure. I think we had a sense that housing had gone backwards, away from the sort of, you know, the large-scale council housing of the 60s and 70s, that we'd gone to an era of lower standards in housing. But I think the pandemic really brought that through, and it certainly brought that through here in Greater Manchester. And I think you need to start there, because what happened in the pandemic, if you look at the map of cases and sadly the death rate, you can see the places where the fundamentals really are not right at all at the moment. And I don't think you can even begin to level those places up until you put those fundamentals right. And they are not currently in the right place. Actually, the places that suffered the most during COVID, I think you could go back, not just decades, you could probably go back centuries and find it was the same places that would have had the biggest challenges. So what did it reveal? Well, for us, and we were living through this in 2020, as we went through that difficult summer of more local restrictions coming in, and then you'll remember the whole debate about Tier 3 that we had with the government. I mean, it was very clear to us that in parts of Greater Manchester, there is a concentration of people in communities who, if they are ill, they can't go home from work because they won't be paid if they go home from work. And I would put it to you, even in non-pandemic times, that is a very serious problem. And we've allowed things to fall too low because obviously that's not good for those people, but actually it's not good for anybody. If that is the nature of your work, where you can't go home if you're not feeling well, then we're all in a bad place, aren't we? Those businesses are in a bad place. But that was abundantly clear to us in the middle of 2020 that was what was happening, and that was kind of driving a high case rate in some communities. But then you have the reality that many of those places also have homes that don't support people's health. Even if they could have gone home, they wouldn't have found actually that the home was a place where health in all of its ways is built. In Greater Manchester, it's estimated that about 40% of our homes in the private rented sector are beneath the decent home standard. Now, how can that, again, be right? How possibly can that be acceptable? Many of those homes in receipt of public funding via the benefit system that landlords will take but not reinvest in the upkeep of those properties, the health of everyone there suffers. And I would say the kind of two fundamentals that drove the high case rate through COVID have actually been damaging health before COVID and after COVID. If you are employed in such a way that you spend most nights lying awake before you fall asleep because you are just worried that you won't be able to make everything add up, then your mental health's not going to be in a great place, is it? And you're not actually going to be that productive when you go into work the next day. But again, this is a fundamental that we've not addressed in this country. We talk about low productivity, a productivity problem in Britain. Why don't we start going back to some of the basics as to why that is? It's because we're not supporting people. We're not putting the foundations down beneath people to be successful. Good work, a good, secure home that comes from having secure work. It's not surprising, is it, that many people can't flourish without those basic foundations. I would go further and say that good housing maintained to the decent standard should be a human right in UK law, because I don't believe you can have, I don't believe levelling up even begin, you can't even get close to levelling up if you've not got that foundation beneath each of our fellow citizens. You cannot have good health, kids can't have a good education, nobody can have a good life without good housing. It's as simple as that. But we don't have good housing, and we don't have secure housing, because people can easily be evicted from those private rented properties, as I know, having worked on the homelessness problem here in recent years. And then away from sort of work and housing, you look at transport. You know, in the communities that we would most want to level up in Greater Manchester, and I know that this conference is about today, they are the places where public transport is currently the most expensive in the country, or the poorest quality. That's what a deregulated transport system has delivered. Because you go to Oxford Road here and you'll just see bus after bus after bus, because they are ploughing the lucrative routes. You go to some of our more deprived estates and you won't see that. And you try and get on a bus there and you can pay, I know you've had colleagues from Wigan here today, you can go to some of the more deprived estates in Wigan and pay £3.50, £4 plus for a single bus journey. Public transport is more expensive in the poorest parts of this country than it is in some of the most affluent parts of this country. Again, how do you level up communities if that is the everyday reality of people living there? So the argument I'm making in answer to the question, how can we level up Manchester's communities or Greater Manchester's communities, the fundamentals have to be sorted out. You can't level anyone up on foundations that are kind of, that aren't there or are crumbling. Good work, good homes, affordable transport, those are prerequisites for levelling up in communities that have some of the biggest challenges. However, let's move it on more positively and see where, if you have those things, where that can take you. Because I believe what Charlotte just said is true, that one of the things that this place has, perhaps more than some, is a fierce sense of local identity and indeed increasingly Greater Manchester identity. People are prepared to give of themselves to build their communities. And I think that is a feature, actually, as a former Member of Parliament for Lee in the Wigan Borough. I always kind of felt that sometimes it is the places that have least are prepared to do most, because they understand more how they need to help each other and support each other. So there is something kind of really valuable to work with there. And I think we are beginning to show that through devolution in Greater Manchester. We've got a huge amount of good work going on. I know you've heard from Wigan this morning about the work that they did through the Wigan deal and the assets-based approach, where we kind of started with a kind of belief in our communities, rather than the old top-down approach of councils, thinking that they were in charge of telling people what to do. Turning that around, I observed it as a Wigan MP, really started to kind of turn the way people engage with the council around, and it was fantastic to see. But we see it in Rochdale, we see it in Salford. There's really good practice emerging in Greater Manchester. But I think we could go a lot further. So just to tell you a couple of things that we're doing for ourselves, which I think could kind of, if we say we've sorted those fundamentals, where we could get so much more for the money that we already have. So I, together with the 10 leaders of Greater Manchester, have taken a decision from here that we are going to link public procurement, all public procurement in the city region, much more to those fundamentals around work, for instance, and the living wage. We have something called the Greater Manchester Good Employment Charter. So that will now be front and centre as we place a much higher social value weighting into procurement. If you want a specific example of something that's happened here, look at our waste contract with Suez, which had a 20% social value weighting. They say it's completely transformed the way in which they can give back to our communities and work with our communities to build agency and assets that matter. So we're going to take that approach further now and look to create the highest possible social value weighting linked to the Greater Manchester Good Employment Charter. We have been very clear going forward that we will not procure from organisations that don't pay the real living wage or don't have a plan to get to net zero. And that is a very firm position that myself and the 10 leaders have taken. But if you take the notion on a little bit further again, what we will want to do is start to link it more to community wealth building. So through public procurement, with that social value weighting, start to think about how do you not just kind of build wealth by having more payment of the real living wage, but actually embed the funding within those communities so that they can benefit. So we are in the process of establishing a community wealth hub at the Greater Manchester level, which was a recommendation of our Independent Inequalities Commission, led by Professor Kate Pickett. Look it up, called Good Lives for All. Much of what I'm talking about today you will see in those pages, and we've drawn heavily from it. If all public bodies start using full social value procurement power and link it to community wealth building, the development of co-ops, social enterprises, community and voluntary organisations at the local level, I think that starts to level up our communities, and it gives them a sense of agency, which isn't always there at the moment. I would also go further and say, I think it does, if you want to level up places that most need levelling up, I think there is an issue about the control of assets. So what was really important about the Wigan deal when it first emerged was how the council was prepared to transfer assets to community organisations. And I saw that in Tilsley, which I used to represent, where a swimming pool was transferred to a community organisation, and it's now a much better facility than it was ever as a municipally run facility. But that was a bold thing. But I think you've got to go much further with that. And I'll just let you into an insight into where my thinking is going with regard to the trailblazer devolution negotiation we've been offered through the Levelling Up white paper. So Michael Gove has offered the West Midlands and Greater Manchester the chance to sit down and negotiate the deepening of our devolution powers. I mean, one example I will kind of give you now, which absolutely I'll be arguing for, is the transfer of some national assets to our level so that then we can engage the community in their use. And I'm talking specifically about rail stations. You know, you go around the country, some of the critical infrastructure that could be used to build community benefit and wealth is actually inaccessible to some residents because it's not fully accessible to disabled people, but are massively underutilised from a community or a commercial point of view. So control of assets seems to me to be really important, and that's where the local trust, if the community's got something real to play with, I think that's when the local trust can come in and then help people innovate and think about how they could use that asset to improve the local community. So transferring those assets is absolutely going to be a part of our ask going forward. I mean, other things just to mention, we will be making the argument that, for instance, money from the benefits system needs to do much more to level up some of our least affluent communities. Can it be right that we currently pay billions of pounds of housing benefit or local housing allowance as a country to landlords who own properties that are beneath the decent home standard. Can that be right? I don't think it can possibly be right. I think we do need to have a much tougher approach to that. If people are to receive public money in respect of renting out their property, it should be a given that it is maintained to the decent homes standard. So we'll be making the argument as part of the devolution discussions that linkage should be made, and we want to link local housing allowance to the Greater Manchester Good Landlord Charter that we're bringing through as well, alongside our good employment charter. Please don't underestimate the importance of transport. It is outrageous that, I always use this example, that a single bus ticket in Harperhay, Greater Manchester, costs more than one in Haringey, London. But it does. You know, you're talking £3 there. It's £1. Is it 65 in London now? You know, how much longer are we going to tolerate that inequality and that unfairness? Because people in that community need the ability to travel if the employment is not there on their doorstep in the way that it once was. So I have taken the decision to put buses back under public control for the first time in 36 years here. That will begin in Wigan and Bolton on the 17th of September next year. We will place a cap on the cost of adult single tickets of £2, £1 for under 16s, and we will be looking to maintain free travel for 16 to 18-year-olds. I think these are the kind of policies that can start to connect communities that most need to be levelled up with a transport system that works for them. So I've reeled off quite a lot of stuff there, and you can see where we're going. And actually, I would say, if you look around this place, and if you kind of feel what's going on here, and you tap into some of the debates that we're having, not just at the Greater Manchester level, in our councils as well, there's a lot of positive energy flowing around, even though there's frustration about where levelling up as a concept is at the national level. We have used what we've been given. We have reduced homelessness here, number of people sleeping rough, quite significantly over the last few years. Myself working with our 10 councils, we have brought in a free bus pass for 16 to 18-year-olds. We are building out the Greater Manchester Good Employment Charter, as I've described. You know, things are happening from the bottom up. And the argument I would make is, imagine what we could do if we were given more ability to do more for ourselves. That is what this place wants to do. Doing things differently isn't just a slogan. That is how Manchester has always worked. It has been something of a radical outsider to the sort of the London world. It's always done that, but it's often come through with good ideas, good innovations, good disruptions that change things for the better. You know, it was the home of the suffragettes, the trade union movement, and some of these reforms that this place kind of gave birth to all those years ago, you know, have had a lasting impact on this country. And I believe if the government said now that, okay, we'll really free up to see if devolution can deliver, and we'll go for it and let Greater Manchester stand, you know, we'll take the risk. You know, we'd be prepared to do that. You know, we would say, well, give us the chance to do it. What I do know is the status quo has not worked for the people of this city region, or indeed the wider north. You know, that's why we're not letting go of this call to level up. And it's absolutely brilliant why, you know, you are all in this room discussing it. But I'll finish on a broader point that I think is kind of deeper, I guess, than anything I've said so far. And it is a reflection on my 16 years in Parliament, when I was trying to argue for a place that you would say, classically now, I hate the idea that it's called Red Wall, but it is now called a Red Wall constituency. You know, I spent 16 years in Westminster, and we did do some good things to level up Lee. But was it enough? Well, no, it wasn't. And I kind of look back as to how that system works and the way that it doesn't really connect with what's needed on the ground. I made my maiden speech in Parliament in June 2001 and pointed out, as I did many years after, that Lee was the biggest town in the country without a railway station. And in my naivety, I thought I would get a call the next day in my office. Oh, Mr. Burnham, it's the official from the Department for Transport here. That station you're calling for, should we come and you'll tell us where you want it? And yeah, okay, the call never came. And I think it's because the system is kind of hardwired against communities like Lee. You know, the way the Treasury allocates money it's not built with Lee in mind. There's a kind of whole approach here that goes right to the top of the Treasury, where the country gives out more money for the areas that will give more back more quickly. It's a kind of recipe to kind of give more to the places that already have most. And that's the country that we live in. If you think about it from a political point of view, what you actually have in the Westminster system is huge power concentrated in quite a small number of hands, to be honest with you. Pretty much the people in the government and some of the most senior civil servants. And I would say, in the current political system in this country, having been within it for a large part of my career, it's easier for entities that want to level down communities to engage with the Westminster system than it is for those communities themselves. So it's easier for an organisation like P&O to get into see a minister than it is for somebody representing a community to get in and put their point over. But as we know, those entities can level down communities at a stroke, and yet they seem to have more access to our political system. And if you look at it from the other end, I think one of the reasons that we're having this debate goes back to the 80s, actually, and mistakes made since, where local government was kind of undermined in that era and was never restored. And I think this is a problem for us as a country, that we don't have the sort of agencies at that local level fully resourced to level up communities. Councils have been stripped of power and resources over the years, so they can't even maintain basic things like libraries or community centres. And those are the kind of assets that you need to keep if you're going to do levelling up in a meaningful way. So I guess what I'm coming to is, I personally think we need a complete rewiring of the way the country works if you actually want to level up. Leveling up is not an easy little thing that you can kind of solve in an afternoon, as nice as it is in a museum like this or in a room like this. It's a much more complicated thing where the fundamentals of the country have to change in the way funding is given out, in the way political power is used in Westminster itself. We need a Senate of the nations and regions, not an unelected House of Lords, as far as I'm concerned. Because how do places get their voice equally represented in Parliament if we don't have a Parliament that reflects and represents all places equally? And we don't have that at the moment. I would call for a major strengthening of local government as the essential building block of levelling up. But I would also call for full devolution of power out of Westminster so that the English regions can do so much more for themselves. Because if you did all of that, I think you would then have the conditions to level up places that have been failed really over decades, you could even argue over centuries. So I've winding journey in my life that's taken me to this point, being in front of this lectern today. I can only give you what I've observed and what I think, and 5 years to this very day that I've been in this role, elected 5 years ago today. I don't regret it for 1 minute. I think I'm in the right role. I think it's right for me, but I think it's also right in terms of for this place and for what the times that we're in. Because, as I said, people want levelling up. And the mayors and the voices that we're beginning to bring through, working more collaboratively, actually, than Westminster works, when we're building from the bottom up, working with councils and partners in our communities. I think the call is getting quite loud now for change. We want change. This country needs to work differently. We're not going to put up with more of the same. And it's getting bigger, it's getting louder. And I'm going to be sticking it through. I'm going to be seeing my full term out, and I'm going to keep building this, because I feel we've got the best chance of changing this country, rebalancing it, than we've ever had before. But we're not quite there yet. So, I would say stick with it. Stick with this debate. Keep contributing to this debate. It is about, in the end of the day, the country that we all live in. We've lived through a COVID pandemic, but we've got another one now. A mental health pandemic has landed upon us, and that says again that too many people are living with too much stress and insecurity in our country, and too many communities do not have the fundamentals that they need to support good health and good lives. We've together got to be on a mission to change that. We must never let this phrase go, levelling up. If it's not this government, it's got to be the next government. We should be relentless in saying to them, we demand this, a country across the breadth of the British Isles, if you like, that works better, where everywhere has got a sense of agency, a sense of their own power, masters of their own destiny. We would just live in a much more healthy country if that was the case. And what I've observed when you leave Westminster is you start with place rather than party. You start with the thing that everybody cares about. How can we make this place better? Not how can I get my party elected, which is where they start in Westminster. When you start at the local level, you start with place. It's a unifier rather than a divider. And I think if you got back to that with strong councils, lots of devolution, I think you could level these places up. We're beginning to show that that can be done. But there's a long, long way to go ahead of this, and we're at the end of the beginning, but we need your help in making the next phase really deliver levelling up for the communities that most need it, in Greater Manchester and further afield. Thanks very much indeed for listening, everybody.